So it's not, none of this material really would be from there's two books that just came out, The Stack and Dispute Plan, both of which were partially put together in the seminars that we did here. And so this would be stuff that's going into the next book, which doesn't have a title yet. It has to do with issues of design and philosophy and artificial intelligence, in particular sort of take on artificial intelligence, not as something that exists in a kind of abstracted form of symbolic logic, that a sort of realm of pure mind and mathematics, but rather something that exists only in the sense in which it's embodied and instantiated and materialized in particular kinds of ways, and how it is that that instantiation is co-constitutive of whatever form of intelligence we might identify that might work there in this way. And so some of the things that we will be working through I have listed here, but no total promises for how all of this will necessarily go. Okay. So first, sort of contextualizing in some of the other things that we've been talking about, and thinking of AI perhaps in relationship to this previous book on the Stack, it would certainly have to be understood as a certain instantiation, a certain version of what we call planetary scale computation, and the way it works at different scales: energy and mineral sourcing grids, subterranean cloud infrastructure, urban software and service privatization, interfaces drawn by the augmentation of the hand, the eye, or directly dissolved into objects, users both over-outlined by self-quantification and also exploded into the arrival of legions of sensors, algorithms, and bots. And so to a certain extent, we're talking about AI that it exists at this level of the user within the Stack model, but not only that, really at these other 5 layers as well. So particularly in design, we'll sort of say we might sort of start with the city as a kind of mediary, sort of a kind of medium level scale by which we sort of to work and sort of work up and backwards from this as well. And so first of all, some preliminary definitions. So we're going to sort of move some possible misunderstandings out of the way right away. First of all, we're talking with cities in this way of something as a kind of, first as a sort of provisional settlement organized around some form of agricultural and provision, and it's this initial form of culinary geoengineering in which we reside. And 2, as a node on a horizon that would orient mobile people and things as they migrate and flow. That is, we're looking at the city first as a sort of an encapsulating megastructure that would hold things in place, and second as a throughput point that would accelerate or decelerate things as they move through them and move through the particular orientation of the city's wayfinding interfaces. And so cities defined in this way, with perspectives mixing from, public health planning, supply chain logistics, and so forth, are an infrastructure for living and non-living matter to consume itself, and for some forms of matter to achieve and hone something like sentient intelligence and even sapient intelligence in some circumstances, all of which in turn and in various ways work to remake the city in their own image. We might think about this sort of trying to count and quantify things. One of the things we've been working on is this deep address project, going for a while, looking at the theoretical addressable space of IPv6, which is next generation internet addressing system, works to 128-bit string. As we know, we've run out of IPv4 addresses. Much of the things that we're running the address on now, the internet on now, which is a theoretical address, 16-bit string, which is about 3.5 billion possible addresses. We've sort of all been allocated to RIR. So 128-bit address string, sort of back of the envelope calculation, how does that work? So it works out to something like 10 to the 23 addresses per person. It begs the question of sort of begs the question of the level of the granularity by which something like a ubiquitous computing might actually operate, far below and above the kind of the sort of mere anthropometric thing that our conventional Internet of Things discourse works itself out. So we're interested in this question of how it is that synthetic and augmented intelligence might operate at the urban scale at that level of granularity and all the way on up, not just the things that appear to us in the scale in which we're used to addressing them and being addressed by them. Also, we'll say, just for purposes of this conjunction of some discussions of what we mean exactly by artificial intelligence, to sort of dissuade some misinterpretations, we define or would propose a version of intelligence in this way, defined as a way that matter organizes itself into some form of durable complexity. It's a special form of that complexity, being the city, that settled accumulation of material intelligence, both human and non-human. And so as AI becomes more sophisticated, what does its own design project become? What should it be? And so we see on the one hand AI as a sort of way, something that would animate matter at a certain scale, and also something that it's dissolved or that's structured into matter in various scales, in various ways, none of which necessarily all add up to the same thing. And so we make some distinctions then between robotics on the one hand, programmable matter on the other hand, culinary materialism on the third hand, tangible media on the fourth hand, so as to bring them together back in different sorts of ways. In other words, I see AI not as something might happen in the future, some sort of thing that happens after some great messianic moment, but as something that we see all around us all the time, and in terms of, in the form of, and in the terms of a kind of synthetic reason that we are in the process of designing and designating, in which it comes to, in its own way, contribute to the formulation of our own designations, of ourselves and of it in turn. We also see in it what philosophy of mind calls the other mind problem, how it is that we might communicate and identify and be identified by that intelligence, one with which we can only share at least very partial worlds. We're just not embodied in the world in the same way. We don't think the same way. So how do those terms of those communicate? Which is sort of same sort of questions we might read. So we've been talking in seminary, we might read in Lem's Solaris or Clarke's 2001, these other kinds of alien communication. And so we try to see AI not in terms of how we think that we think, that is, as an image of ourselves, as a sort of in this way, as a kind of virtual or artificial human cognition only, but as something that, as a way in which matter thinks and embodies another spot in a larger shared continuum of material intelligence, of which our own accomplishments of sapience are one particular form, genre, example. Right. And so to situate these then once more, bringing these together into something like a common frame, we could sort of project them in some way across the stack thesis, which proposes in its own way a particular kind of design model for political geography tuned to the question of planetary scale computation, the ways in which it's sort of starting with the technology, working from the inside out to the governance, towards the questions of sovereignty and so forth and so on. And so where we want to locate the AI, where AI locates us in these different scales is not all the same. We want to hold them apart in a certain kind of way. Now, to the design question sort of quickly, and again to sort of it's beginning with some disclaimers. We're talking about the rise of sort of network platforms in the physical world and services geared towards this. We want to differentiate this from a certain kind of conventional smart cities discourse that would see the rise of those in terms of just sort of prosaic forms of consumption and marketing, pedestrian flow optimization, and so forth. I'm not, I hope, talking about sort of hybrid of the Truman Show, Alphaville's Alpha Soixante, smart control and production variations. This is not really what interests me. It's not about the way in which these technologies might amplify or optimize these kinds of doxic relations to the world, but the way in which that they would crack open other forms of kinds of relationships. So again, to jump right in, we would ask then, after something like intelligence, how is it that in this conjunction of computation, of the algorithmic mechanisms and matter itself, computation becomes a kind of solvent of a particular form of algorithmic reason in various kinds of matter. We take it, for example, that computation was discovered more than it was invented, and that the algorithmic generative processes that we might find are intrinsic to the wider unfolding of the world, and that today's meager computational appliances are nowhere near as sophisticated and efficient as those that precede Homo sapiens. We take it that computation is one of the ways that matter in whatever form achieves intelligence through its procedural abstraction that we may tap into, wrangle on some kind of provisional level one way or another. And as such, sapient brain tissue is one kind of matter that has achieved intelligence in certain ways, some of which both clearly are and others that are clearly not, quote, computational in any conventional sense. At the larger scale, we take it that dissolution of synthetic computation, software, in other words, into the urban fabric, provides for a landscape of inorganic forms, a sort of distributed intelligence, because it provides those things with a capacity for themselves for abstraction. which I'll talk a bit about in a moment. That is, we see intelligence in this way as a form of something that accomplishes abstraction. Computation then is a form of, as intelligence, and computation then as a kind of mechanism of abstraction, how matter abstracts itself. So this perspective in principle should account for two related but different understandings. One would recognize, as I say, that intelligence, and knowledge for that matter, is always distributed among multiple positions and forms of life, both similar and dissimilar to one another. That no single neuroanatomical disposition has a privileged monopoly on how to think intelligently. What might qualify as general intelligence is not duty-bound to species or phylum in its capacities for abstraction. We might say, in ways of thinking of it in terms of the ability of any organism, however primitive, to map its own surroundings is this function of abstraction, particularly in relationship to the basic terms of friend, food, or foe. This is a kind of primordial abstraction from which we do not graduate so much as we learn to develop into something like a more formal kind of reason and its local human variations. Think of the protozoa and its cilia in this way. So figuring out what's going on around it. This is this basic kind of mapping as the primordial form of abstraction. And in this way, the mapping function of abstraction is not then through an early stage through which things pass on their way to more complex forms of intelligence. It's rather a general principle of that complexification. As I say, like the protozoa and the cilia feeling about to what's out there, or like humans looking and tasting and imagining patterns. Today's AI, or sometimes augmented by various technologies of machine cognition, sensation, and vision that allow them to see and sense the world out there and to abstract forms of mechanically embodied intelligence, both deliberately programmed for them and emerging unexpectedly. So this sort of emergent particular form of a certain kind of distribution of the sensible, if you like, shifting certain kinds of interest from a Jacquard to Merleau-Ponty, if you like, back again. I want to sort of think of these really, for the rest of the talk, I discuss with you sort of these in terms of three ways. First, a kind of thinking. First, we'll discuss and sort of challenge the conventional Turing test models, humanistic models of thought that would and measure them for their epistemological and practical dangers. From the deep infrastructure of their affects, what we today gather under the name of AI, will shift not only what counts as thinking, but what counts as architecture. Namely, we'll try to evade the presumption that when we'll identify and recognize the threshold of an artificial intelligence to the extent that it's recognizable as similar to our own. Second, skin, epidermal media, synthetic skin, and the design convergence of natural sensation and machine sensing for animal skins like our own, but also for urban skins and surfaces and interfaces, and the implications of this for what we may have once called dwelling, per se. And lastly, machine vision, camouflage, the inverse uncanny valley, artificially intelligent paranoia, and apophenia. So, first, to thinking and such. Now, Turing, as you know, this is Alan Turing. Turing, as you know, proposed his test as a variation on the popular parlor game, the imitation game, in which two hidden contestants, a woman, player A, and a man, player B, tried to convince a third player that he or she is a woman by their written responses to leading questions. To win, one of the players must convincingly be who they really are, whereas the other must try to pass as another gender. In Turing's essay of 1950, which we read in the seminar, he talks about, what if a computer took the place of player A? So what he's really suggesting in this way is not just that a computer would take the place of a person to try to suggest that they are in fact human, but that it would try to pretend to be a woman. This is what a more literal reading would suggest. Now, as we know, the mathematician Turing himself also had to pass, in his case as a straight man in a society that criminalized homosexuality, and upon the discovery that he was not what he appeared to be, he was forced to undergo horrific medical experiments, treatments, let's say, known as chemical castration, and ultimately the physical and emotional pain was too great and he committed suicide. The episode being a grotesque tribute to a man whose recent contribution to defeating Hitler's military was still a state secret. Turing, should be said, was only recently given a posthumous pardon, but tens of thousands of other British men sentenced under similar laws to date have not. One notes, I think, a kind of sour, ironic correspondence between asking an AI to pass the test in order to qualify as intelligent, to pass as a human intelligence, with Turing's own need to hide his own homosexuality and to pass as a straight man. The demands of both bluffs are unnecessary and profoundly unfair, and as for all passing, the performance's success or failure reveals more about the audience than about the performer. In other places, in some fictions, policing the imitation game is a matter of life and death. The plot of Ridley Scott's film version of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Blade Runner, the Philip K. Dick novel, hinges on the Voight-Kampff empathy test, which differentiates humans from replicants. In this narrative, replicants are throttled in two important ways. First, they expire after just a few years, and two, they have ostensibly a rather diminished capacity for empathy. Deckard, the Harrison Ford character, must retire a group of rogue replicants, but first he must find them, and in this world, Turing test thresholds are weaponized, lest replicants pass as humans and trespass beyond their station. By the film's conclusion, Deckard, who himself may or may not be a replicant, develops a certain empathy, we might say, for the replicant's own desire for, quote, more life. And arguably they too, at least the Roy Batty, Rutger Hauer character, seem to have empathy for Deckard's own dilemma. His dilemma, and ours, is that in order to enforce the gap between the human and the AI, defined by empathy or lack thereof, Deckard must suppress the empathy that supposedly makes him uniquely human. By forcing him to quash his own identification with the replicants that supposedly cannot have empathy in return, the principle of differentiation requires its own violation in order to maintain itself. It's far better, I think, to examine, in terms of sort of thinking about how the AI might perform in this way, to examine how identification and the production of the affect of empathy works from our side of the conversation. This is Paro, the baby robot seal, by the way. It's clearly much easier to make a robot that a human believes to have emotions and for which a human in turn may have emotions, positive or negative, than it is to make a robot that actually has those emotions. The human may feel love or hate or comfort from the AI, but he or she is reading cues, not detecting feelings. What seems like empathy is really a one-way projection mistaken for recognition, like the Turing test itself, and not based on any mutual solidarity. Will the wish to define the very existence of AI in relationships to its ability to mimic how humans think that humans think, will this be looked back on as some weird form of speciesism? Perhaps. It may also that this legacy of the older models of AI research sent this research down disappointingly fruitless paths, hoping to recreate human minds from top down as the basic structure, and it just doesn't work. As Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig remind us in their essential AI textbook, biomorphic imitation is not generally how we design complex technology. Airplanes don't fly like birds, and we certainly don't try to trick birds into thinking that airplanes are birds in order to test whether these planes really are flying machines. So why do we do this for AI? Today, the vast majority of serious core AI research is not focused on the Turing test as anything like a central criterion of success other than HAII, or Human Artificial Intelligence Interaction Research, as a criterion of success. And yet in our general popular discourse about AI, the tests or versions of it, the anthropocentrism thereof, holds still such conceptual importance. Like the animals who talk like teenagers in a Disney movie, other minds are conceivable mostly by way of puerile ventriloquism. Should AI arrive, it will not be human-like unless we insist that it pretend to be so, because one assumes the idea that intelligence could be both real and inhuman at the same time is somehow morally or psychologically intolerable. Instead of nurturing this bigotry, we would do better to allow that in our universe, thinking is a much more diverse, even alien phenomenon than our own particular case. Thus, the real philosophical issues and lessons of AI will have less to do with humans teaching machines how to think than with machines teaching humans a fuller and truer range of what thinking is and can be. Now, in addition to the demystification and expansion of thinking in this way, and the relocation of human sapiens within this expanded field, the sensory media of synthetic intelligence may also contribute to a certain kind of undermining of certain forms of a durable Kantian sort of philosophical distinction between thinking and sensing. We've discussed this. So I want to hone in a bit on the ways in which that kind of cartographic abstraction, mapping what's out there, can in fact also be dermal, related to skin. How it occupies and agitates skins, human skins, building skins, any skin, and how this does so also for the purposes of mapping. And so I touch briefly on these. Extending what something like a skin-based media, an epidermal media can be. And let's keep with the skins of humans for a moment. We recognize that while in the late 19th century, cinema and photography allowed for it to be possible to compose and to see sorts of images we had never seen before. Montage, slow motion, double exposure, and so forth. And the same goes for synthetic and recorded sound, or auditory senses. Our largest sensory organ is our skin. And however, quite obviously, today, we have not developed nearly as diverse forms of sophisticated forms of artificial touch or tactility or feeling for skin-based media as we have for vision and hearing. Clothing, or at least one way that we have leapfrogged genetic evolution to augment skin, i.e. it's faster than evolving fur or blubber, is to engineer scuba suits. So part of the research that, working in more practical research, engaged with UC San Diego, with the Center for Design and Geopolitics, in collaboration with our Department of Nanoengineering and Bioengineering, is some exploratory research on how the sort of, let's say, the presumed space of difference between natural selection on the one hand and machine sensing on the other is elided by certain technologies that operate in and on the skin and at the scale of our dermal and epidermal somatosensory system. Mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and so forth. And by this, I don't mean some kind of O word game by which machines are bequeathed with panpsychic capacities of intuition and affect. Rather, I refer to real-deal technologies by which biological and non-biological physiochemical reactions are literally interwoven in and at the scale on the sensate skin. Artificial skins are also among one of the more areas of design research more generally in this way. DARPA, for example, has long funded research into advanced prosthetics, and currently one of the research tracks focuses on providing a form of synthetic tactile sensation in the form of sort of virtual fingertips that might go on the end of those prosthetics. People who are actually wearing them could use them as a way to feel and to touch the world. And other kinds of dermal surfaces that would enable corporeal extensions for the wearer. And in other labs near us, one can find varieties of epidermal microelectronics that augment the living skin's capacities for sensing internal or external symmetry. Next door to these, nanoscale chemistry cooks up inks that react to the presence of ambient trace elements of whatever particles they're tuned to react with. And so designing chemical sensitivity at or near the atomic level in this case, and the registration of those as a transmissible information with dermal and epidermal microelectronics at larger scales, we can conceive really of a real mediatization of sensate surfaces. Together, these technologies suggest something like a skin-based microstack comprised of biological and chemical and mechanical sensing and processing in various combinations. As an emergent formulation of wearable computing, here also including biochemical reactions, it blends, as I say, animal sensation, machine sensing into a kind of composite surficial media. And as platforms for haptic interfaces, of touch and motion interfaces, its terms of, quote, interaction may be below or above normal perceptual scales. and may involve autonomic nervous reactions as much as, if not more, than the relatively blunt gestures of hands and thumbs. These dermal, epidermal media, both the ones we have, the ones the ones that we anticipate, make it possible to sense things about the external world that our skin otherwise is not able to register, particulate matter, sense at the scale of parts per trillion, or things about our internal state, the pH balance in your sweat, whatever. But the longer term and really more interesting design horizon for skin-based media are ones that would allow bodies novel and unnatural forms of touch sensation that we have perhaps never experienced before. Pleasure and pain are on the menu, but more besides. So think of it this way. Again, early in experimental media, their innovations with artificial visions and sights and sounds is one precedent. But also perhaps is molecular gastronomy and the rebuilding of food from first principles on up. And if we include taste as a particularly nuanced form of touch, which of course it is, then what are today novel tastes are models for new sensations to come. The same holds true, I would argue, for the redesign of the surfaces of the city, its skins. Urban interfaces are also sensory mechanisms. Sometimes they're binary gateways that allow or prohibit admission to their domain. Other times there are reactive skins that sense threshold events by reacting to light or sound or touch, ambient trace elements. And as we meander the city, these interfaces are also our habitat, and we dwell within them. But they are dwelling as well. They sense us as their world, and we are their habitat as much as they are ours. We are organisms living inside of them just as they are inside of us. So ubiquitous computing at and in the city's skins and surfaces of interfaces we see as something like urbanism as nested parasitism, or nested parasitism as urbanism. Now, from touching to seeing. By shifting this line of inquiry up to this urban scale in this way, what we take to be the artificially mediated surface includes things that are analogous to skin, but what also those things what we would today refer to colloquially as a kind of machine vision, quote unquote. Now, vision has evolved independently many times in evolutionary history, and arguably in the past 2 decades or so, it has evolved again. This time not for cuttlefish or rattlesnakes, but for network CCD sensors and algorithmic armatures processing what is sensed into differentiating and motivated recognition and cognition. Quote unquote visual sensors responding to light, often but not always shaped like cameras, are one kind of designed surface capable of synthetic sensation and computational interpretation. But in the wider urban landscape, they too commingle with networks of other superficial sensors responding to motion and pressure and heat and ambient air qualities, so forth and so on. And so again, to the extent that it's epistemologically and functionally convenient, we call these variously machine vision, machine hearing, machine skin, but of course any real correspondence to and from the mammalian sensory apparatus is merely allegorical. The AI city may be embodying itself, but as I'll say a few times, not as we do. Now, as for the media technologies that link the two, link these together in a certain way, into particularly the question of vision or light in this way, we might say that when information is scarce, then copying something is the work of the mechanical image. However, when information is abundant, especially when it's overabundant, then seeing the original, picking its pattern out of the background, this is the work of machine vision. For thinking animals, seeing and making things is easy, but making copies of what is seen and made is hard. For machines, on the other hand, making copies is a way of seeing and is much easier than thinking, or perhaps is a kind of thinking. And in the varied history of the multiple and, as I say, independent evolutionary careers of vision, various photoreceptor cells found across the phyla may have evolved from many different kinds of chemoreceptors, and most likely well in advance of anything we might recognize as a fully fledged brain-like information processing organ. Further, we could say that Photosynthesis is also in that it is a chemical response to light. And so in the broadest sense, it too could be considered as a kind of vision without images. Now, within the Animalian vision image making nexus, the one that we most successful is, of course, primarily human, and it's likely that from the beginning to the end of the Holocene, that the total quantity of images that humans have produced, from cave walls to FaceTime, measured, I don't know, per year, total pounds of images, total terabytes of information, so forth, continues to increase exponentially. Now, with digital imaging machines in everyone's pocket, the raw sum of total images produced, some would say since the year 2005, others argue 2008, may be more than all of those produced up to that moment. It depends, of course, on how you define and quantify an image. But what Walter Benjamin called the mechanical reproducibility has certainly allowed images to proliferate far beyond the means of human craft. Further, today many images are made for no one, but this does not mean that they're functionless. They are made by and for machines that see the world differently than we do. Those machines don't have eyeballs or rods and cones or a visual cortex, but they do have sensors that detect light and motion and form and heat and color in other ways. And such today that the industrial scale processing of that data that has been gleaned by scanning the light spectrum in some way, from urban scale street surveillance to millimeter scale quality control along assembly lines, represents a significant fraction of all of the work that the world does to image itself for the purpose of governing human society. At the end of the day, the machinic phylum may take more selfies than selves do. However, the function of representation at work here is probably rather different. The quote-unquote image may likely remain data and is never re-rendered to look like a picture because there's no need. An algorithm programmed to discern a particular pattern or anomaly can see it directly in the data itself. It doesn't necessarily need for that data to be projected as if for a mammal and then re-seen and reinterpreted back into code. Like any algorithmic scanning and sorting of any large data set, the fact that the original source was or is, quote, visual is not so critical. So, again, like plants, do machines also possess a kind of vision without images? Or at least a kind of image that suggests a very different form of abstraction toward a very different kind of corporeal experience. That is, an abstraction that's based on chemical or informational pattern finding as that cartographic simulation of experience, or as that experience itself. Perhaps surprising to some, perhaps not to others, then, that the function of machinic images today and of their abstractions, both animal and algorithmic, is in many cases, if not actually predominantly, to determine the veracity and originality of what those images supposedly represent. For example, some of the shapes printed on dollar bills, or euros, or Swiss francs, take your pick, are there for humans to differentiate the value of one token from another, but far more are for machine vision counterfeit detection to verify that this is a real dollar. The piece of paper is full of machines that happen to look like pictures. It is an image as machine. Or a surveillance scan of a city may pick out one face, one body from thousands of motions, looking for the one true target. Elsewhere, we insert tiny camera probes into great paintings which have verified that they are originals, as is often required by insurance companies backing purchases. Online captcha software shows us an image, and then in a quick inversion of the Turing test, analyzes how the human user interprets it to determine if they are, in fact, a real person. So we conclude, perhaps, that Benjamin's assurances that mechanical reproduction would undermine the aura of the original is true when, for example, we compare a painting with a postcard of a painting. However, machine vision and images as machines are put to work to ensure auratic originals, verified non-fakes, true identities, unbroken versions, normal targets, certified real deals. And so a kind of revolution is made back around. As the image is more fully technologized, as it becomes itself a machine in some cases, then Benjamin's historical arc from the pre-mechanical original to mechanical copy is incomplete without another curve leading now to what? The machinic authentic. Still, if cities are always in some way about vision, to some degree, and again, Benjamin makes an appearance here as well, we think of this in terms of how we see it, which is fine, or see each other through it, also fine. But you should also think of it in terms of how it sees on its own terms. The machinic visual subject that it puts forth is not something that possesses necessarily human-like or human-level perceptual and aesthetic capacities of discernment, of connoisseurship, but rather something that is interesting because it does not possess those things and yet can see us, recognize us, and know us regardless. And that's weird enough. So there's the question on the one hand of how the world looks as a screen, and another, more important, I think, is how we look as objects of perception from the position of machines with which we co-occupy that world. Seeing ourselves through the eyes of this machinic other who does not and cannot have an affective sense of aesthetics is a kind of disenchantment. We are just stuff in the world for distributed machine cognition to look at and to make sense of. Our own sapience is real and unique, but as we are things to observe that just happen to be sapient, this doesn't really matter to machine vision. This disenchantment, I think, is more than just like hearing the sound of this recorded sound of your voice on tape. That can't possibly be me. It's potentially the clearing away of a more closely guarded illusion. This uncomfortable recognition in the machine's mirror is a kind of, perhaps, a reverse uncanny valley. That is, instead of being creeped out at how slightly inhuman the creature in the image appears, we're creeped out at how unhuman we ourselves look through the creature's eyes. Now, the politics of this are also a bit, certainly we're fraught in their own way. In writing a book, as I'm doing about artificial intelligence, I found in some ways I didn't expect that it's in many ways fully impossible to separate the technology itself from the sometimes bizarre ideas that we have for it and about it. And as I'm fascinated by how technologies are not only anthropomorphized, but how some are considered menacing and others amazing, and some both at once. There's a way in which part of this is part of a genealogy that we might take, at least through the Tausken, the influencing machine, sort of the ways in which this apparatus just beyond our understanding has come to take on a kind of psychiatric significance. Whether the aliens are reading your thoughts through radio waves and dental implants, or Google is reading your thoughts through the email, the borderlands between schizophrenia and sensible vigilance, delusion and deductions are disputed territory. Perhaps it comes down to a level of discomfort, not just with how some people see technologies, but with how some people think technologies see them. The occult artifacts of planetary scale computation are a cracked mirror, and reflections seen there are given to a Manichaean and dualistic and sometimes even bipolar political psychiatric imaginary. For example, deep dream. Last summer when I was here, we had the deep dreams. I'll tell you about these in a moment. This is a project that Google's research had released sometimes this summer. Bifo, Franco Berardi, and I were having breakfast here as well. He and I, so we don't particularly we don't usually think about Google in the same ways, let's say. But we were both totally amazed by these images with this as well, and how there's ongoing conversations about this these represent a new kind of image we haven't seen before in such a long time. So those of you who aren't familiar with these as well, basically what was looking at on that summer day last June happened to be on the front page of every newspaper. was a project undertaken by Google Research where you understand these sort of object and sort of feature recognition algorithms that will analyze large data sets and look for particular things. So how it is that your photo app knows, which face you are, or that's a horse or a dog, or the rest of this as well. They're interested in a way, it's like, what kind of feedback loops could this sort of provide? What happens if it tries to see something that's not there, but you force it to see it again, or you ask it to see it so often as well? And this is kind of what this done. In the simplest sort of explanation, there's the process is kind of simple find edges function, like you might do in Photoshop, where you sort of filter the image to sort of make the edges, everything a bit more what it is in relationship to things around it. You then ask it to look for the thing that it's looking for. And then you do this again. And then you do it again, and then again. And you feed this back through the system over and over and over and over and over again. And it starts to actually compress the image and start to find things that it's looking for that aren't actually there. A kind of AI hallucination, if you like. Now, there's a bunch of websites you can go to. You can take your own vacation photos and upload them and have them be dreamified, if you like. Food is horrible to do this as well. Porn also will not recommended. Now, the images, I think, are remarkable enough on their own, irrespective of their provenance, but once the viewer, I think, makes the partial, and of course it's always partial, empathetic transference into the other mind of this feature recognition algorithm and its way of seeing something, the effect, in a way of kind of trying on a new mode of perception, making sense of the world through those eyes in this way, that's the real payoff. Even if it's an example, as I see here, of a kind of AI apophenia, the false positive as a core. So what is, before I want to stop on this for a moment, what is apophenia? Apophenia is the psychological phenomenon of false pattern recognition, where you see a pattern in something that's not really there. Pareidolia is the subset of apophenia, where you see faces in things that aren't really there, and you see them whether you want to or not. You can say, it's not a face. I know it's not a face. You're going to see a face. It's not necessarily a kind of process that you can be, disenchanted of by being told so in a way. But it's a causation-causality dynamic where you see some correspondence between things and you deduce that there must be some causal relationship between these two things in general, these sort of pattern structures of apophenia. Conspiracy theory is apophenia as a form of political science, if you like, in this form as well. But it's who we are and what we do. It's this kind of pattern finding, even the false pattern finding, is intrinsic and necessary to our evolution and to our sapience. We are who we are, and we can't sort of go on without it. Think of it this way. There's a character, I'll tell you, so there's a character in Peter Watt's recent novels, one of a handful of really good novels about AI, a novel called Echopraxia. And in this story, one of the characters relays this explaining apophenia to one of the other characters in the novel. The character then argues that this false pattern recognition is hardwired into our Homo sapiens evolutionary success. And the story goes like this. Tens of thousands of years ago, two guys are hiding in the tall grass, quietly looking around for both predator and prey. One of them sees a faint but distinct anomaly in the way the light breaks through the grass, moving left to right, and he recognizes this pattern as that of a looming cat and runs away back to the village, leaving his friend, who does not possess those pattern recognition genes, to be eaten. The guy who ran away was able to reproduce. His pattern recognition genes ensure his and their survival. And the guy who did not possess those genes did not reproduce. Simple as that. However, there was a third guy sitting in the similar grass, perhaps the morning earlier. He too thought there was a tiger and got up and ran back to the safety of the village. But in this case, there was no tiger. It was all in his mind. He was not cunning, he was paranoid. Yet he too was able to reproduce, and his faulty pattern recognition genes, which are perhaps actually the same thing as the first guy's accurate pattern recognition genes, were also able to reproduce as well, perhaps with the second guy's wife, I don't know. The lesson is that evolution has greatly rewarded both positive, successful human pattern recognition, but is also bound inextricably to the bounty of that bargain. It has also rewarded hallucination and error. And so, it's one thing to caution paranoia about Google, but it's not as if Google's algorithms are are themselves, as if they are not themselves also deeply paranoid. After all, they see psychedelic dog faces in everything. Now, the reason that Deep Dream hallucinates dogs is itself not spooky. Its object recognition faculties were used to train using an image data set called ImageNet, which is based on various breeds of dogs. Dogs all look different. You train the recognition to identify that a poodle and a Great Dane, however, all constitute dog. It's this easier than this is a more difficult accomplishment. And so it will therefore hallucinate dogs where there are none, and to identify people as dogs if it is told to look at them hard enough. Now, this latter may seem insulting, but maybe it shouldn't. You recall that Diogenes' proto-cosmopolitanism is based, after all, in the glorious dog-like community of us all. And so if Deep Dream's images are artifacts of a computer's hallucinations of phantom conclusions, then perhaps the conspiratorial figure cut by evil Google's stepfather is that same paranoid vision turned inside out and back on itself. Perhaps Google, the AI, is as paranoid in how it sees us as some of us are in how we see it. It's not coincidental or surprising then that as AI matures, its own pattern recognition faculties would reach the plateau and accomplishment of creative apophenia. From Antonin Artaud to Seymour Cray, there's a number of ways in which we have perceived some kind of homology between abnormal human psychology and various machine behaviors. And so, is machine vision paranoid? Is our popular understanding of machine vision paranoid? What is Google up to? Are they watching you? And if so, who or what are they seeing? Is our understanding of Google's paranoid machine vision itself paranoid, making the paranoid AI that much more paranoid in response? In a word, yes. Is this how artificial intelligence should evolve in relationship to and autonomously from human intelligence? Well, if human pattern recognition is any indicator, based both on productive and destructive apophenia, deception and delusion, then yes and no. So, moving then back up in scale to AI and machine sensing as a whole, at the level of the whole city, and in this redistribution of the resensible. Again, the AI city may be embodying itself, but not as we do. The commingling of diverse sensors of light and air and sound and chemistry draws up a landscape of sensing and thinking little species, partially embodied discretely one with another and partially co-embodied with one another as their information inputs are aggregated, modeled, and acted upon in various pluralities. Homo sapiens comes equipped with an extraordinary array of sensory faculties, which, as we discuss, may be augmented further by synthetic layers in various ratios, ranging from the sensors and trackers in our phones that we carry about like mules, to more intimate media of artificial images and sight and sounds. Situating ourselves in this expanded field, again, we are both sensors and sensed. On the one hand, we are a primary sapient actor in the drama, supervising an orchestra of sensing technologies, each individually capable of functional processing and together of certain forms of aggregate emergent intelligence, such as ours, for example, neurons. On the other, we're not only the subject of the scenario, we are also its subject matter. That wider urban landscape of synthetic sensory systems is not only a platform through which we extend and extrapolate our capacities for abstraction, distributed cognition, it's also capable of other sorts of abstraction on its own. And as part of its intelligence, it looks at us and registers abstractions about us. And again, then, not just AI in the city, but nested AI co-embodied as the city, with very different sorts of organisms to population, to genome, to niche, to signal morphologies at work. And thus the work of abstraction for organism, for design more generally, is not only to deploy abstract forms, but to set in motion mechanisms and programs that are capable of their own feats of abstraction, and to calibrate how they abstract us and one another accordingly. In short, we should imagine an AI urbanism, a bit in sort of like Van Uxkal's stroll into the field, populated by intermingling but mutually oblivious little life worlds. Or in terms of Deleuze's parable of the tick, the later laying in wait for some threshold event to come its way, at which point it triggers a programmed response, leaping out into its own little void. Many of our urban sensors and their limited forms of AI work similarly and with similar nobility. More versatile synthetic intelligence occupy more complex Umwelt. Some are predators and prey, some are in motion, some are flowering, some pollinating. And as we stroll among them, we may be registered by them or we may be ignored. We may be a primary cause of concern, we may be a passing interference in an evolutionary dynamic in which we are neither the protagonist nor target. And this is, in a way, as we might expect, actually not so surprising. As we know, the shifts from top-down to bottom-up AI, particularly in robotics, has been marked by a shift of emphasis from intelligence as a formal syntax to one of a specifically embodied relation to specific worlds and models. Heuristic knowledge of habitats is seen as inseparable from how an AI manipulates a situated problem space. And so in robotics, the pairing of synthetic sensing, in vision for example, with algorithmic reasoning allows for simple artificial species to perform intelligently because they have what amounts to functionally an embodied perceptual location in the world. They can think because they can see. Now, the implications of all of this for our politics and geopolitics and all the rest of this, as I say, are fraught and tangled and profound and banal in various measures. It extends from the biochemistry of climates and ecosystem to the rhetorical conventions of citizenship and sovereignty. It's messy AI is what we're talking about, not a kind of clean and pure AI. And so I'll conclude this presentation with a few admonitions toward a general interdisciplinary design brief for AI and for what we might call the post-Anthropocene. It is, at best, a paradoxical accomplishment to survive a mass extinction event. The modern human species has the dubious distinction of not only observing and measuring mass extinction while it is happening, but also doing so with the understanding that it is one of the preeminent agents of that event. It does so with the ambivalent comfort that one way or another, it too is unlikely to survive the bloody edge of the Anthropocene intact. As so much departs, what arrives? Simultaneously with the collapse of biodiversity, we also see, at least the strong potential for, an explosion of new quote-unquote species taking form through robotics and synthetic biology and artificial intelligence. We can't see the latter as replacements for the former, and yet there they are. Recall, for example, that the first Earthlings in space were not humans, and that a very low percentage of all Earthlings in space have been humans. Human biology is needy and fragile. It is poorly suited to space travel, largely because we have to bring an entire ecosystem with us, from oxygen to radiation filters to the microbial biome in our intestines that help us digest food. As currently configured, humans, we cannot really leave Earth because we have to bring a miniature Earth with us when we go. This is not true in the same way for other species which survive comparatively easy in space, such as metalloid robotics and perhaps also someday some kinds of synthetic biology. And so perhaps like the small mammals that took over after the Cretaceous Paleocene extinction, they're just better suited to the very different punctuated equilibrium to come. They may enjoy successes that we cannot, leaving us behind and stranded in place. So what comes then after an Anthropocenic extinction? The only thing we can know about the post-Anthropocene is that it's an era in which humans would no longer be the dominant geologic actor. Perhaps a new earthling species may prove to be more fit, better at making the next evolutionary steps than humans are, and so for us to, quote, survive, we may have to become more like them and less like what we are now. In the longer view, humans' role may be that of an enabling intermediary between early primates and as yet to emerge phyla that blend organic and inorganic flesh and thinking. This is the point of convergence between robust AI and the deep ecologies of voluntary human extinction. But instead of disappearing, however, we may survive by perforating the boundaries between animal, vegetable, and mineral as our design problem and design solution. And so while this stage is the death of the user, a certain kind of death of a certain sort of humanism, and the eclipse of a certain sort of resolute humanism, it does so because it brings with it also the multiplication and proliferation of other forms of non-human, inhuman, exohuman agents and subjects, including, as we've said, these sensors and algorithms and robots, from nanometric to landscape scale, any combination of with which we may enter into a kind of relationship as a composite subject. The complexities and contradictions of those sovereignties in relationship to those composites are nevertheless, with those quasi-intelligent senseis actors, as I say, work to dismember certain conventional distinctions between subject and tool, occupant and city, and so forth. Introduces a certain kind of redistribution of a certain kind of agnostic universal suffrage by which what kinds of matter can enter into that position and take on that throne, claiming a different kind of strong materials, perspective, and territory. But we anticipate, without a doubt, that as this works itself out, as that disenchantment unfolds, that we anticipate all manner of pushback against this demystified and demonized mathematics. Not only a distaste for certain forms of quantification and a preference for romantic verse, for example, but a bulwark on behalf of what amounts to a pre-Copernican and deeply reactionary humanist exceptionalism, even a humanist fundamentalism. A pushback, as I say, as fervent as perhaps as irrational. There are, that is, certain affinities with certain technologies, however fictitious or bizarre those affinities may be, that are thought to embody the essence of a kind of creationist order. One of these is food, and certain forms of technologies of personal mastery, such as the car. I did it when the Google X was beginning to work on their driverless car project. I went up and visited the labs up there with a student of mine who was now working on this, and when I was meeting with him, I asked him, so you guys must have heard a lot of different kind of strange ideas about what the driverless car system is going to amount to, and what the sort of pushback from this as well. And they say, well, funny you should ask. They pull out this piece of paper which says the intention to file preemptive legal notice or something, which as far as they could tell is just a completely made up document. There's no such thing. From a group called Gun Owners of America, which is an advocacy group a bit to the right of the NRA. And you remember that in the United States alone, roughly about 30,000 people a year are killed in car accidents, but 28,000 a year of those are directly attributable to human driver error. And so if driverless cars could kill 27,000 people a year or less, they would still be, from a purely consequentialist view, an ethical sort of advantage. And so the idea that it would be, at a certain point, determined for purposes of that putting a human behind the wheel is just too great of a risk. That it's just unethical to put everyone else at risk in this sort of in this kind of way. It sort of makes sense. And so, what this document was saying is that should it become illegal for humans to drive a car in this way, that they will seek to have automobiles reclassified as a munition, and thereby covered by the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees the right to bear arms, in this case, a car. Or, put it this way, your life may be ended by someone encased in a 2-ton steel box careening down the asphalt trying to prove a point about how technology will never capture his natural humanity. Now, all of this is not without real risk. We anticipate that this distribution of perception and co-embodiment implied by sensate AI at the urban scale would, if we are attentive and persistent, shift and expand what we take to be an ethics of shelter and of encounter, of negotiation, and even immunity. And in this, the modern era form of urban anomie may pale in comparison to the challenges of predator-prey, camouflage, dissimulation relationships implied by the emergence of various alien minds at urban scale. So negotiating our way to a livable post-Anthropocene necessitates, however, I still argue, a fidelity to emergence, not to emergency. Because Copernican traumas that abolish the false centrality and specialness of human thought and species being are priceless accomplishments. And the advent of robust inhuman AI could provide for similar disenchantments, one that should enable a more reality-based understanding of ourselves, of our situation, and a fuller and more complex and nuanced understanding of what intelligence is, what thinking is and is not. And from there, we can hopefully make our world with greater confidence that our models are good approximations of what's out there. Always a helpful thing. An additional harm of the alternative to that is in perpetuating a relationship to technology that has brought us to the precipice of a sixth great extinction. Arguably, and I would make the argument, that the Anthropocene itself is due less to technology run amok than to the humanist legacy that understands the world as having been given for our needs and created in our image. We still see this everywhere. Our computing culture is deeply confused and is so along these same lines. We vacillate between thinking technology as a transparent extension of our desires on the one hand, and of thinking of it as an unstoppable and linear historical force on the other. For the first, agency is magically ours alone, and for the second, agency is all in the code. The gross inflation of the former is merely inverted back into the other. And this is why we can't have nice things. A well-known thought leader in the world of design recently wrote, he'll remain nameless, quote, "It's time to invent a world where machines are subservient to the needs and wishes of humanity," unquote. Simply breathtaking, I think. If you think so, I invite you to Google pig decapitating machine. And then let's talk about inventing worlds in which machines are wholly subservient to human wishes. One wonders whether it's only from a society that once gave theological and legislative comfort to chattel slavery that this particular claim could be offered with such satisfied naivete. This is the sentiment, this philosophy of technology, exactly that is the basic algorithm of Anthropocenic predicament. It's time to move on. This pretentious folklore is too expensive. And so, put differently, please to make technology serve humans and serve human needs and desires and requirements appear utterly misguided and even suicidal. Staring upon the abyss of mass extinction, we hear the drearily common refrain, variously explicit or latent, that identifies, quote, modern technology as the main culprit, and the conclusion that the most fundamental solution is to de-technologize the planet and to re-humanize ourselves, one presupposing the other in various measures. This is among the worst possible plans, both philosophically and practically. First, it's tragically deaf to the priceless Copernican trauma of the anthropogenic precipice, that our status as the dominant geologic actor is fleeting, and so in order to survive, we would have to become something that is not necessarily and recognizably human. And second, it props up a psychotic misrepresentation of what humans and humanism actually are. We are the brain-eating apes with weaponized hydrogen atoms who organize our societies according to Bronze Age poetry on human sacrifice and ritual purification. Among the last projects to support is rehumanization in any sense of a direct return to historical norms. I think the other species would agree. But lastly, what of desire then? How do we map this sort of technological material recompetency as a theory of subjectivity against the tropes, or with the tropes of Eros and Thanatos? It's tricky. Freud barely had Darwin to work with, let alone genetics and genomics. And so those terms should probably be read a little bit like one reads the Greeks. Organic versus inorganic, that is, whether something is alive or not alive, is sort of a minor issue in this way. Something having or not having a carbon molecule, this is what defines something as organic, isn't the thing. Any melting back into the inorganic, the thanatonic impulse in a way, and to be overcome and overwhelmed by and absorbed by matter itself may be a way of encountering and even desiring death, perhaps, but it's also in many ways a very everyday kind of occurrence. It's not a sad destiny to be interwoven with alien matter and other diagrams for that dissolution are possible, both anatomic and economic. The human body and this earthly landscape of matter are only the default settings. They're not destiny. Chemistry may drive the most radical forms of the philosophical imaginary to come. A culinary materialism is the word puts it, yes. Rubbing the clinamen raw. And so here among the algorithms, the winding evolution of vision returns to the primordial function of scanning the landscapes for food, friend, and foe, and learning to think in relationship to that map. Some alternatives, some of them might think that to this in a way, I think make the inevitable, whether we wanted to or not, geoengineering project that really actually constitutes the eco-geopolitics for at least the 20th century into something that is either disqualified a priori as a metaphysical atrocity, or something that will simply sort itself automatically by the invisible hand of Moore's law. The former is animated in various guises by a kind of mystical primitivism that is to me the theologic expression of a mode of global dwelling that sees the world as here for us, based on a fetishization of human experience that takes priority over the materiality of the emergent intelligence. Again, it is this humanist exceptionalism that is the exact recipe for our Anthropocenic predicament, and the accomplishment of a viable post-Anthropocene necessitates its refusal. In this fetishization of the experience of experience as an authentic interiority for one, or the psychotic proposition that somehow the self is a stable physical entity that can be expanded exponentially by various forms of computation without exploding into some fractal plurality, as for the singularity people. Both of these make that geoengineering project much more difficult than what it is and make it harder to recognize it for what it should be. Something that is more like molecular gastronomy at landscape scale. A resorted and restored ecology designed to taste itself in new forms of richly spiced and imaginatively sauced mutual ingestion. Last word, lest I'm misunderstood to recommend too much of today's computational cultures as model for the AI design that I'm sketching, I'll end by misquoting a sentence from Adorno's Minima Moralia, substituting the word smart cities for his original topic of escapist cinema. It is not because they turn their back on washed-out existence that smart cities are so repugnant, but because they do not do so energetically enough. Because they are themselves just as washed out, because the satisfactions they fake coincide with the ignominy of denial. The dreams have no dream. Thank you.